Hello and welcome to the Soil Technology Sustainable Food Production from the Ground Up webinar, brought to you by the Institution of Environmental Sciences. This webinar is part of a lunchtime series hosted by the IES, providing our members with regular CPD opportunities. They are usually free and generally only available to IES members. If you're keen to attend future webinars, then please visit our website, which is www.the-ies.org, and explore the range of benefits you can receive from the IES by becoming a member. Today's webinar will be presented by Jacqueline Hannam, Research Officer in Soil Systems, focusing on pedology and soil hydrology at Cranfield University. Jack has been involved in various research projects, including the development of a decision support system to minimise soil damage during sugar beet harvest with British Sugar, as well as researching the effect of afforestation on soil carbon stocks with Forestry Commission. Her research focuses on how soil changes at field to landscape scales, in particular how this affects soil functions and how we manage our soil resources. Today she'll be discussing soil health, soil diversity, and some of the future challenges around soil technology. Please submit any questions that you have in the chat box at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen at any point during this webinar, and these will then be included in the Q&A session after the presentation. So thank you for your attention, and please stand by because this webinar will be starting shortly.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Jack Hannam, and thanks for the introduction, Vienna. I'm based at Cranfield University, and this seminar will be all about soils. And as Rihanna mentioned, I work at the field and landscape scale, so there'll be lots of maps to show you during the presentation as well. So this webinar came out of an article that I wrote for IES in one of their publications, then looking at how we feed over 9 billion people by 2050. So how can we actually do this sustainably without degrading our soil resources further? So I want to cover a number of things. Here's a summary of the webinar so far. Is actually to look at soils in a more holistic manner and recognise the sorts of ecosystem services that soils provide, as well as providing food for the global population. Then start to look at, well, what are we doing in terms of changing the soil properties? What does this mean in terms of how healthy the soil is and how it has a capacity to continue to sustainably produce food for us? We have a quick look at the fact that there's a no one-size-fits-all approach, because although most soils just look brown and muddy to most people, they're actually quite diverse, and this means that their properties and functions mean they have different capacity for these different ecosystem services. So how do we sort of measure this health? Well, there are lots of approaches where we start to use and integrate new technologies. So we're looking at sort of precision farming approaches by measuring properties proximally, so from a distance, or remotely from a distance, or proximal, where we're actually testing soils in situ. There are lots of things that we'll do for that. So I'll go through a number of technologies that are currently being deployed, particularly in the agricultural sector. And then just sort of highlight then what's actually missing and what are the future way forwards then of assessing soil health using soil technology. So first of all, we want to look at about food production in the UK. So you might well say, well, why do we actually need to think about producing more food on the land? Why can't we just put more land into agricultural production? So if we look at this map, I've got a little quiz to start you off, make sure everyone's paying attention. So how much land do we actually have in the UK to grow food? So if we look at this map, the brown and the bright green areas are land that is already under arable or horticulture or improved grassland, so things like dairy and grazing. So in the chat box, could you estimate the percentage that you think that the land is covered already by those two land uses, by agriculture and horticulture? Anyone going to go for it? Some people are typing, good, some things coming through. 17, some people have read the article, that's good. 95, 80, 75, 25, 7, oof, lots of things. Great, 70%. So yes, you're right, some of you are right, the big reveal, it's 70%. So already we are using, in the UK, 70% of our land for agricultural production. There is not much land to go into. Most of those areas, as you can see, are in Scotland. So these are areas that are already protected by national parks, or there are other areas which have natural constraints for agriculture due to climate or the soils themselves. So we're already using the available land in the UK for agricultural production. So we need to think about growing more on the land that we have and how we can do that sustainably. So then we need to think about focusing again on sort of agricultural efficiency, productivity, but also how to produce this increase in output sustainably on the soil resources that we're currently using. Obviously, since the war, since we have this big push for having food production that is sustainable within the UK, so being able to feed ourselves. Of course, in the light of Brexit, this is now becoming another issue because we import quite a lot of our food into the UK. So increased outputs through crop breeding, technologies in terms of pest control products, and also, of course, input of artificial fertilizers has increased production in those post-war years. But how can we do that in a more sustainable manner? How can we use those inputs a little more cleverly to be able to make sure that we're not actually damaging our soil resources? So soils obviously underpin most of the agricultural production in the UK. We know that a lot of those are becoming degraded. So, for example, there's been a loss in the percentage of organic carbon in arable soils in the UK. Over a number of monitoring programs have shown this already. So we know that we're starting to compromise some of those properties of the soils that are important for sustaining food. So without this sort of sustainable soil management, you know, from the ground up, if you like, we're not able then to produce food sustainably over a longer time period. And actually, probably a lot of our the yield that we're attaining of crops in the UK at the moment is being masked by the inputs that we're putting in. So the soils may be becoming degraded, but we're not actually beginning to see that. So we might then potentially be moving towards a tipping point with some of our soil systems. So thinking about soils in a wider context, so at the top there and on the left-hand side are the sorts of ecosystem services. So this is a big concept most of you have probably heard of. So how does soils sort of fit into these ecosystem services? Well, they are big providers. So we talked about food production, but also in terms of raw materials and medicines. Also, a lot of our antibiotics come from soils. They also have a huge importance in terms of regulating the environment, particularly any water that's moving through there. So they have a large role in flood mitigation, also in terms of purification of any water that's moving through that system. They support, obviously, habitat or crops and things that are growing in there. They also provide support for infrastructure in the urban environments as well. So the soil is also sustaining our built environment. And again, there's some more esoteric services, such as these sort of cultural and aesthetic qualities that the soils provide to us. And how can we then think about the capacity of those soils to deliver those services? We're asking quite a lot of the soils, not only to provide food, but also buffer water, to mitigate floods. So we have this inherent capability of the soil, depending on its inherent properties, for them to actually perform that function. So are the soils very fertile? Can we grow lots of crops in them? We have this kind of reference sort of state. So some soils are very good at being able to provide a platform for infrastructure, others are not, for example. And then we have this condition. So what is we need to measure then what the state of that soil is. So what is the health of that soil? What is its actual capacity at this point in time to then support those different ecosystem services? And again, as I mentioned, are there any tipping points then? Are we moving towards some systems where we know we're really stretching them in terms of actually providing those different services? So one concept then is actually then looking at soil health and how we can measure this. So what sorts of properties are important? And particularly the focus is mainly on food production in the UK. So what can we do to actually find out how healthy these soils are? So as I mentioned, you know, there's no magic bullet, unfortunately. So there's no sort of one size fits all approach. Another map. Soils have very different inherent capabilities and capacities. So this map shows the distribution of different soil types, albeit at quite a coarse scale, in England and Wales. So could we again use the chat box to estimate how many soils we think are in England and Wales, the ones that have been recognised? Hazard a guess, 296, hundreds. Some are very specific, some a bit more general. Any others coming through? 300. I recognise some names. Hello, Jill and Julie. Michelle, 700. Yeah, well, okay, Michelle's cheating because she's read. Okay, any more coming in? So at our most detailed level of the way that we classify soils, there are just over 700, about 720 different soil types recognised in England and Wales. So all of these have slightly different properties and characteristics, which mean that they have different capacities to deliver these sorts of ecosystem services, which means they all have slightly different reference states, if you like. So when we're looking at soil health, what does that actually mean? Do we, it's very difficult to have a benchmark value for a particular property because each soil inherently will have slightly different properties. So if we look at, here is just a smorgasbord of different sorts of soil types. So they're very different. So this diversity, like I said, means that each soil has a slightly different function. They have a different capacity to actually support these ecosystem services. And again, we need to think about, well, if we start to then use benchmarking, how can we do that when we have such a variable baseline in terms of our soil properties in England and Wales? So when we talk about soil health, what does that actually mean? Well, that's quite a good question. There's still a lot of debate. So this is one definition that I've put here on the screen. So again, this is looking at the concept of the ability of the soil to actually sustain its most important function. So some soils will have a greater capacity for delivering food, others will have a greater capacity for regulating water or for flood mitigation. So we need to think about, we're demanding quite a lot from our soil resources, but to actually work with those inherent characteristics to actually mean to develop those soils so that they can actually have the capacity to deliver those sorts of things. And 70% of our soils in the UK, we are demanding a production function from them. So 70% of that land, remember the map at the beginning, we want soils to either grow food or grass for livestock. So we want them to do this function. How can we do that sustainably and then work also with the inherent characteristics of those soils so that we actually can deliver that production function sustainably? So soil health is this encompassing definition, which means that there's lots of different properties, there's lots of different things that we might measure under this banner, things like organic matter or soil carbon, the actual soil biology, so the microbiology, which is important in terms of nutrient cycling in soils, the soil structure. So again, that's important in terms of how the capacity for that soil to retain infrastructure, but also in terms of its capacity to accept and receive water. Linked to that is the bulk density, water retention. So there's many, many more. So we have this large collection of potential things that we can measure in soils, which give an indication of how healthy these are. So some of these are inherent characteristics that the soils have. Others are ones that we potentially can manage through the land management systems in the UK through agriculture. So this is I won't get you to read all of this. I've just highlighted some of those ecosystem services. So through thinking about the provision of food, so being able to provide more food sustainably, we have a number of properties down the left-hand side. And these are then linked to these key services in terms of the providing food. So whether they provide nutrients or water for the crops or actually just support plants, we can see that there are a number of different properties that the soils have, and these then can be linked to soil health. So at the top then there are certain things that we can't necessarily do much about, or we might actually change. So potentially we can change the depth or structure of soils if we degrade them. We can't do much about the soil texture. That's an inherent property that we can't change. But there's other things that might be more manageable, such as organic matter status and pH, by actually putting amendments or changing different land management practices. So we can start to think about, we can start to manipulate the soil health to ensure that we have this provision of these ecosystem services for the provision of food, for example. So how then potentially could we then use soil technology to measure soil health? So we have all these different properties, and classically then, most people are taking spot samples in certain places, on farms, at various places that they're doing environmental consultancy work. And again, those are then taken back to laboratory, they're measured in the lab, and then the findings are reported. So again, this is quite a laborious process. Quite often it involves expensive lab equipment. We all know probably how much it costs to send samples off to get measured for certain things. And in some systems, these are not necessarily, if you like, deployable at a field level. So we might want to actually then give the land manager some information about a specific field or the variability within that field, so they can start to manage those systems more appropriately. And this is important because, as we mentioned before, 70% of our land is actually managed. So we need to be giving advice on changing those properties to the land managers themselves, and feedback in terms of what they're doing in terms of whether their resources are starting to be degraded or whether they're starting to improve certain soil properties. So we're going to look at there's a whole range of technologies that can be used. So rather than spend the next 3 hours talking about them, we start to think about methodologies that they've been used. So again, I've split it up into two characteristics in terms of measuring soils. So from remotely, so through remote sensing, so this is looking at technologies that can be deployed a few meters to a few hundreds of thousands of meters from the soil surface, and what sorts of information that can give you. And others which are more proximal or close to the soil, so either they need to be in direct contact with the soil itself or can be deployed within a few meters of the soil. So again, we have another little quiz. So I've just pulled out some of the technologies that I'm going to talk about in the remaining slides, and some of the soil properties or characteristics that they might be able to tell us about. So if we start off with remote sensing, so these are sort of optical images that are collected by satellites. Do we think, again in the chat box, what is the primary thing that they can detect? So 1, 2, 3 or 4, so physical characteristics, soil variability, soil carbon or soil chemistry. So have a think about, so 1, 2, 3 or 4 for remote sensing images, what sorts of things that they might be able to detect primarily? Number 2, 1, 2, 2, 1 plus 2. Great, thank you. So primarily, I'll reveal the answers in a minute when we'll go down. So geophysics, so things like conductivity, a little hint, think about time team. You've been watching them, so Jill, 2. Technologies, so little hint there, prod. And for the last one, reflectance spectra. A bit of a cryptic, it's like doing a crossword. 3 and 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Good. Thanks, I'm glad to see everyone's still paying attention. So primarily, these are the, if you like, some of the answers to those. So remote sensing is then, primarily detecting soil variability, the same with geophysics. It's tends to be what it's deployed for at the moment. Again, the strength-based things, looking at soil physical characteristics, and the reflectance spectra, again, one of the main things is looking at carbon and also to some extent soil chemistry. Okay. So if I want to just go through some of those technologies in terms of the current status of those and some examples of how they're being used, and then we kind of look at then, well, how are they actually being applied in a sort of land management context from that position. Okay, so if we're looking at remote sensing, so most of you are familiar with the images that we get through Google Earth. So again, this is looking at the sort of reflectance data. So we're looking at different bands in terms of the wavelengths, and these tend to be collected by mostly by satellite platforms, most familiar ones. And most of that data then is actually available that can be downloaded from the NASA website or the European Space Agency through the Copernicus program. Obviously, these things can also be deployed on planes as well, and there's also imagery that can be collected, quite often now using UAVs and drones. And these tend to be processed then into different indices that can be used for sort of classification. So the classic ones are the normalized difference vegetation index. So this is looking at the vegetation signal. This is looking then at the signal from the plants through the chlorophyll, and you can identify then the vegetation. So this is not actually sensing the soil itself, it is sensing the stuff that is growing in the soil. But if the crop is then showing some variability that's due to some inherent variability in the soil, then potentially you might be able to pick up a soil signal from the crop that's growing in it. Where you've got rid of the vegetation, this makes it much easier to sense the soil, so on bare ground, but of course not all land surfaces are bare. They are at certain times of the year, so if you have imagery during periods of when the crop has been removed or harvested, then you're able then to potentially detect differences in the soils, but only for bare ground. So some examples for this, again, it's another index related to these bands or these wavelengths that you can then do to try to detect some of those differences in the soils themselves. So this is the left hand of the image is the raw imagery. So a lot of those bright coloured things, you're starting to see that there's actually crop in the fields, but in those areas in between, you're starting to see those sort of river networks. These are actually old drainage channels. So this is an area that's in the fen. And actually then we're picking up the difference between a very dark soil that's surrounding these drainage channels. So by applying these indices, we're starting to pick out some of these river features. So you can start to look at then the variability, and you can see within the fields there's quite a lot of in-field variability. So this is telling us that we've got a change in the soils, not telling us what that change is, but it's telling us that there is actually a change. And what we could do then is use the vegetation index to see whether we have a crop response also over these different areas, which might give an indication that the soil is then leading to a change in the efficiency of that crop in those particular areas. So this is from a research project that we did with one of our students. So this is taken from the IPF website. So again, they've been using this as data that they're giving land managers. So this again is soil brightness index derived from a satellite imagery over a field. And some of those red lines that you can see are some of these delineations that have been made by a soil scientist. So if we compare them, you can start to see that if you like, the on the ground verification of that variability by a soil scientist kind of matches those brightness. So we can start to see that that's providing us with some data on the variability of soils across the field. Again, we don't know exactly what's causing that variability, but probably in this case it's due to some calcareous substrate that's closer to the surface in those lighter areas. So it's a very brief overview of the remote sensing. So if we look at things that are closer to home, so if we think about actually technologies where we're in direct contact with the soil or close contact with the soil. So these can also be mobile, so they can again track properties in space, so do mapping, or they can be stationary, so you can make measurements but over time. They can be in situ, so you can actually then look at the properties in the field itself and collect data in real time. Or they can, what we term as ex situ, so they still require a sample to be taken for laboratory analysis, but usually that laboratory analysis requires less time than conventional analyses that are used to measure soil properties or things like nutrients and carbon. And quite often these are commonly, if you like, indirect measurements. So they're like a proxy for a soil property. So there needs to be some inference or calibration with some other data that you've already measured or with a particular reference library. So if we go back to mapping again, sorry about that. So if we think about proximal sensing, we can also produce maps, so look at variability of soil. So again, we've looked at remote sensing data. This is using a slightly different technology, so looking at BC electrical conductivity. So this is deployed quite often. There are lots of companies now in the UK that are selling this service to land managers and farmers. And this is then looking again at mapping. So just the data itself is not giving you an indication of exactly what those changes are, but it's likely to be a change in the soil texture, the moisture content of, so again linked to the conductivity of those soils, and also the salt content. So this is another illustration, again, similar area to the area that I showed you for the remote sensing data, where we have these old drainage channels going through this field. So we can see that that's being picked up by this conductivity mapping. So this can be done, again, on bare soils where we have the conductivity meter off the back of a quad bike or that can then produce a map but then that information then the farmer can use to assess his variability in field. So looking at soil moisture, there's lots of sensing technology that is available. Quite a lot of the horticultural industry is using this, particularly for scheduling things like irrigation. So you're measuring your water content in real time. So quite often then you have a probe. A lot of these are based on, again, on electrical conductivity that is measuring the moisture content, which is calibrated to specific soil types. Again, these tend to be sort of point measurements within field systems, so you can start to connect up networks. And then if you are working in an irrigation fed system, you can start to use that data to actually schedule some irrigation events that are needed for particular high value crops that are grown in the field. So again, these tend to be, you're looking more at a time continuum in these sorts of technologies, where you're interested in how those properties change over time, and also in space between different fields, depending on what crops you have growing in there. So if we think about other, again, ways of sensing soil moisture, but also other things as well. So if we think about this reflection spectroscopy, so again, this tends to be used quite often. These are discrete samples, again, taken from the field and measured in the laboratory. So it's looking then at the response to the molecular structure to that radiation. So this is particularly sensitive to things like the oxygen-hydrogen bonds in molecules. So again, not surprisingly, it's sensitive to water content. So the two graphs are showing you then this sensitivity, the one at the top in terms of the wavelength of that spectra, and the reflectance indicated by the water absorption at those different wavelengths. And the the graph below that is then looking at soil samples with different water content, so increase in the water content from the top to the bottom, showing then the increase in the intensity of that absorption at those different wavelengths. So we've used this relationship then to measure soil moisture. There are other properties that can be measured then, particularly things like carbon as well, where they require a calibration. So quite often what happens with these samples is that you need a large reference library where you've measured samples using the classic methods, where you're identifying soil carbon, soil nutrient status from, if you like, wet chemical methods, and you then can make an inference from the spectra to then disentangle the signal that is related to these different properties. These sorts of things have also been developed in the field now, so there's quite a lot of research where people are trying to move this system out into the field to have, if you like, real-time or on-the-go measurements, which is more useful than collecting samples and going back to the lab. And then you can start to think about actually mapping these properties in space as well. So there are a number of research groups developing what they call this on-the-go system. So these are the spectrophotometers. So similar to the previous slide, this one, which is on the lab bench, is actually encased in a mounted system on a trailer here. So you're controlling the light intensity here, and this is measuring at these different spots the spectra. So you're actually getting a measurement in real time of the soil in situ that is not taken then back to the laboratory and processed. Again, this is a development of this type of technology to actually become field deployable. And the sorts of mapping then that are being used then, again, so this is just an example for soil carbon content. So what they've done, again, is made a reference library. So the graph on the left is looking at the organic carbon that is predicted by the spectroscopy against the actual measured carbon of discrete samples that were taken. So you still need to do this calibration. You can't just go out in the field and measure this directly. Different soils will have different responses to the spectra, and also, of course, because it also detects moisture. If you're collecting data at different times of the year where the moisture content is changing, you then have to take that into account in the signal as well. But this is showing that some of those benchtop technologies are actually then have the potential to move out into the field system. Okay, so we look at other things. Again, this is looking at other sort of indices of soil health. So we look at structure or bulk density of the soil itself. So we know that the use of heavy machinery in agriculture has been compacting a lot of our soils, and this is causing issues in terms of crop productivity. So if we want to then measure the, if you like, the health status of this particular property, then we can use these sort of static measurements. On the left-hand side, this is a colleague of mine measuring using a penetrometer. So he's pushing a stick into the ground. This is measuring then this resistance of that, and this is linked to then how compact or dense the soil is. And again, you know, this is quite laborious. There are other methods that we can use. So another research development is actually then doing this on the go. So having a system where, again, we have something that's pulled through the soil off the back of the tractor, and we have this number 2 is the probe. So this cone, similar to the one on the left, that is then inserted into the soil to actually measure this in the field itself. And then, of course, you have the capacity to measure quite a lot of samples across the field system. So what is the sort of current state of the art then? Just to sort of summarise, there are many, many more of those as well. That's just a selection of the sorts of technologies that are currently being deployed or are being developed in the research community to then be deployed in the field system. So, you know, we have this capacity, huge capacity for a large amount of data that is being collected, particularly through the remote sensing. There is a huge amount of data that is being collected daily, which has the potential to be used then for, you know, investigating the soil system. Then these remote systems mean that, you know, they are non-invasive, these measurements. You don't necessarily have to take samples. There are other sensors that are coming online for specific chemicals, so particularly things like identifying available nitrogen in soils, which obviously is an important nutrient for crops. So quite a lot of these, there's been development of cheaper sensors that then can be deployed in the field themselves or measured directly by land managers. And again, there is the capacity, so think of soil health, we don't just want one particular property, we want to be looking at all those different properties together. So we can actually think about fusing a lot of those technologies. So some of those proximal sensors then looking at fusing those technologies together, looking at compaction, but also looking at the spectroscopy. So we start to acquire more data in one pass as we're going across the field. And again, we have other measurements that we can use in real time. So like soil moisture measurements, where we can start to think about advising in real time about, you know, the availability of nutrients or water and the need then to adjust land management practices to those. So we have this ahead of us, this quite exciting time ahead where we can start to think about, you know, sensing the soil environment to give us some information about what the soil is doing and what we are doing to the soil and what we can do then to sort of improve soil health. There are, of course, quite a lot of technological limitations for a lot of these new technologies coming online about whether we can actually take them out in the field or not. Some of them are very sensitive to movement or light or changes or temperature. And still, quite a lot of those still require a reference to standard methods. So the spectroscopy is quite exciting, but you still need some calibration data for that. And we mentioned before that soil biology is another indicator of soil health. And again, there is no quick methodology in the field to then assess your diversity of soil biology at the moment. And then the last question, which I want to talk about a little bit more now, because this is sort of relevant to actually managing those soil resources. So, you know, what does the land manager, what does the farmer do then with all this data? Well, there are a number of businesses that are, of course, using a lot of these precision farming techniques and technologies, particularly things like electrical conductivity mapping. And they are sort of offering sort of data platforms and some interpretations for things like soil management zones. But quite often they still remain as layers, so there's no sort of systematic interrogation of the data. So that they provide data, but limited interpretation. And again, they're not necessarily fusing those data sets together. So there has been a lot of discussion from if you like, the stakeholders, from the farming community, we're living in a very data-rich world, but at the moment we can't turn that data into information where we can then make decisions. So if we go back to this example where we had some remote sensing data from the soil brightness index, we have a number of different layers that are provided to the farmer that's paying for this service. So here they've actually asked for some expert opinion from the farmer themselves about how they think their soils are varying over this field, and they've delineated that. We've got some data on the brightness index, which is showing that there is some variability. And we've got something about, well, how is the crop actually responding to that variability? So some data from the telematics from the cereal harvest. So this is looking at crop yield. So again, we can see there are differences in those regions that have been zoned, where we have low yields in the red areas and higher ones in the blue and green areas. So we've got this data that's sort of giving us some information where the soil is varying. It's also affecting the crop yield. What can we do about it? Well, though through those zones, there's still taking a sample and taking that back to the laboratory. So there's no in situ measurement of that soil property, still relying on information about that variability from a spot sample that's taken. And then from that, a recommendation is made for those different zones for management, either varying the rate of application of fertilizers or seeding rate, for example. So we're kind of at this precipice where we've got all this sort of data and information. So we've got this zoning, we've got some sampling, and there are sort of toolboxes available, but quite often they are just a viewer, where the land manager can just view those data sets, and there's not necessarily a process that's making that data into a particular decision. So one way that we were thinking about sort of fusing some of those data sets is to use some sort of geostatistical techniques where we can start to look at some of clustering those data sets together. So this is an example that we were doing for G's growers. So again, using some of these data sets that are now becoming readily available. This is just an example of the EC map, the yield data, and various other spatial data sets that we had on the depth of the soil and other remote sensing data sets. So we start to put those together and actually see where we start to see similarities in the field for all of those data sets. So we start to cluster those. So these different colours on the map are just showing then the interrogation of all that data together. So what does this actually mean for those different areas? So if we just take one of those examples, so here we've got this red area where we're looking at, it's got these particular characteristics in the proximal data and the yield. What's that telling us? Well, we're not sure. What's the land management interpretation? Again, it's showing up an old field boundary. So is that important or not? Probably we need to do some intervention in terms of soil compaction, for example. Others where we're certainly showing lower yields, again, around the edges of the fields themselves. So again, what is then that decision that is needed by the farmer? So this is the point that we're at now, is then trying to fuse a lot of that data together to actually produce something that's useful for the land manager in terms of how their soil is actually responding and what they need to do about it. So if we imagine looking forwards, then we have this kind of data-rich environment on the future farm. So we've got data that's collected by drones or from satellites, so all this remote sensing data. We might have automated systems that are doing weeding, so these agribots over in the other, or harvesting, or actually looking at the crop itself, so looking at how the crop is growing and responding to different inputs. Other things like smart tractors, so of course most systems now have global positioning systems on them, but actually then you have automated systems that are steering. So we have controlled traffic farming already, trying to minimise the amount of compaction. We have livestock also in the system, so again they are monitored in terms of their sensors, so they're looking at the animal health. That is all feeding back then to a system where we have a cloud of data, and actually we're using all of that, and it's learning from itself year in, year out. So we get data on the crop yield, on the climate, all of the other data. We have a network then of also sensing the soils themselves, so as these technologies become cheaper to deploy, we're able to see then what our land management decisions are doing in terms of the soil health. But this is kind of like, if you like, the holy grail of where we should be going in terms of soil technology, to actually join up all of those things to give the land manager information, in particular about integrating particular options with the soil technology. So at the top there we have the soil system, its physical, biological, chemical, so that if you like looking at the soil health, and we have underpinning that this soil data from technology, and in between there we have different choices that the land manager can do. They can feed into that system, into that data, and say, okay, I changed the tillage in this system. What impact has that had on the soil physical or biological health? I deployed some cover crops during this rotation again, and then we can actually start to sense how the soil is responding to that and whether that's a positive or a negative change. Okay, so I'd just like to wrap up. There's quite a lot of information. So, I mean, for me, it's very exciting. I mean, there is a real big potential for all this spatial and temporal data that we have. We're not quite there yet in actually bringing it together into something that is useful for land managers, but that hopefully is on the horizon. We need to think about how we can transfer technology from other disciplines, so quite disparate disciplines, maybe even the healthcare system, to develop new sensors that can be buried in the soil, that can collect this data in real time and actually measure the soil properties themselves rather than having this inference system. Can we start to use what we call low accuracy but high frequency data, so things that can be measured by the land managers themselves? How can we integrate this into these other data sets? Again, we need to be developing these decision support tools based on that data, but also then offering some land management advice to those people that are actually working 70% of our agricultural land in the UK. And finally, there needs to be then, of course, this is probably the biggest question at the end, the support system then in terms of policy. So this is a big time ahead of us in terms of Brexit, about how then we can support those land managers to actually farm sustainably, and how is that agricultural policy going to look post Brexit, and how does soil health actually fit into that? Okay, so realise that it's now time for the Q&A. So I'd like to thank you all for listening. I think Rhianna's been collecting all the questions, so I'll be responding to her as she's compiling those. Okay, I'd like to thank you very much. It's been really enjoyable. Of course, you can contact me directly as well. Here are my details. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Jack. That was a really interesting webinar, very topical. I've got lots of questions actually that have come through, which is great. So the first few that I'll start off with are a little bit more about kind of the farmer's perspective, a little bit more about data, and then they move on to kind of the measuring sides of things. So this is a question from Jay Neal, and he said, what is the appetite currently for sharing data publicly? And have there been any kind of citizen science initiatives around that are soil related?
It's quite a complicated one to answer, but a very good question. Thanks, Jay. There's obviously an issue in terms of, so a lot of data that's being collected is in the commercial sector at the moment. Some of it is in the public sector, some of it is being sold in other sectors. So there is a big problem with IP of data and data sharing, and again, this is one bottleneck, if you like, at the moment with developing some of these systems where we want to start to integrate some of these data streams. So it's unfortunately there's nothing that's been resolved so far. In terms of citizen science, there are definitely projects happening at the moment. So there's a lot of soils data on the UK Soil Observatory. It's a portal of data sets that are available from different research organisations, so UKSO, if you Google that you'll find it. And linked to that are a number of apps that have been developed by CH and BGS in particular, so you can actually input data yourself about the soil. And so it's all geolocated, so that you ask questions about what the soil type is like, what the colour is, these sorts of things. So there are the uptake of that again depends on the appetite for people to do this. So, but certainly people are feeding into those data sets. Yeah.
Okay, sounds like there's still a lot of work in that area to kind of come forward. And you touched on this after the questions came in, but people were curious to see how much kind of farmers and land managers actually understand soil, and if there is much resource and help for them out there. But I think you've kind of explained that in time that will be coming, but currently that is a bit of an area of development. So another question we've got from Nicholas Benson was regarding the mapping with conductivity. What can the land manager then do with that information kind of in real terms? And would you grow different crops in different sections of your land and things like that?
Thanks for the question. So at the moment, what they're tending to do with the EC data is actually just using it to zone the soil. So they make an assumption that the soil is different based on the patterns in the field. And then they will actually go within those zones and collect samples. And from those samples, so usually they're testing for things like nutrients and carbon, soil texture, they will make a recommendation for the land manager depending on the zonal, on the zones themselves. So what will happen quite often is they will recommend a different rate of application of nitrogen, for example. So what you can do is plug in the map into the GPS system of the tractor. So when you're actually making an application, it will change the rate automatically as you're going over the field based on that recommendation from the EC mapping. But it still relies, all the EC mapping is doing is showing you that there's variability. You still need to find out what is causing that variability.
Okay, that's great. Can we move on a little bit to the measuring side of things now? So someone's asked what sort of soil factors are commonly measured in situ currently by land managers rather than soil scientists?
So again, quite often there will be spot samples taken for things like nutrients. So this will be linked to the agronomist that the land manager is working with. Again, it depends on the availability of resources quite often, and whether there's an issue in certain fields in terms of whether they need to change, for example, the application rates, for example. So things that are actually sort of buried in soils that are measuring stuff in real time, quite often this equipment is expensive. So things like the moisture probes, for example, are quite often only used for very high value crops, so things like horticulture, so things like vegetables and salads and things which require irrigation. So at the moment we're still in the system where we're relying quite often for things like other soil properties like carbon and things like the nutrients on spot samples that are taken by the land manager's agronomist and then sent off to the laboratory, and then they will interpret the results and give some advice to the farmer based on those results.
Closely to that, another question is from Richard saying, is degradation measured in terms of productivity or presence of contaminants?
Yes, so the degradation is a very broad issue. So when we talk about soil degradation, it encompasses both of those things and a number of other things. We might talk about soil compaction is another degradation issue. So again, it's about monitoring soils and the capacity to do that at different levels and what technology we have to do that. So certainly in some contexts, again, looking at the urban environments, then most of those, if you like, the degradation processes will be likely linked to contamination. In an agricultural context, we're then looking at the issues related. So in the UK specifically, for things like soil erosion, that's accelerated by land management practices, things like soil compaction, things like the loss of key soil properties, such as I mentioned before about soil carbon. But again, it's quite difficult. We have had a couple of monitoring schemes in the UK. These are currently being funded now. So, at a national level, so if we want to think about sort of linking this to policies, we have no national monitoring scheme that is currently live at the moment in the UK. So Welsh Government is currently linking some soil sampling to the Glassdeer programme. So, the amount of information is quite sparse in order to sort of feed into those sort of policy decisions, if you like.
Earlier on in your presentation, you mentioned the use of drones in terms of collecting data, and there's a question to see if it's possible to use NIR on drones to cover larger areas in a short amount of time, or does the spectroscopy need to be much closer to the ground in order to complete that?
Yeah, so there is some development in the research world to put the spectrometers onto drone systems. So again, there are issues with being able to sort of maintain the height on those. So you can fly them fairly close to the ground surface. So depending on the payload of the drone, you can attach all sorts of things like this to it. So certainly there's a development at the moment in the research community that they're starting to do that. Again, you will still need a kind of reference based on the spectra, depending on the soil properties as well. So you still can't really get round that issue. But certainly that is one method that can be used to actually then collect data over larger areas.
Okay, so a technology that's being developed at the moment, yeah. Okay, we've got a few more general, wider, broader questions. And one is the lack of returning urban food waste to agricultural areas, a significant factor in soil quality?
Quite a difficult one to answer. I don't know, is my honest answer. So I'm not sure what happens. So I live in London, so they collect my food waste from the curbside, but quite often that will not go into large-scale agricultural production. So if you think about the sort of waste in terms of like the circular economy on the farm, so they will be using certain waste streams. So quite often some large farming systems will have anaerobic digestion, so they are burning waste residues or growing things like maize to be able to provide energy, and part of that process is a digestate that comes out of that, and that will then be used on the farm itself. In terms of there's been quite a lot of work done over the decades of actually things like sewage sludge to land. So there's obviously a lot of policy related to sludge to land, and for water companies to develop those products that are available for the farmer to purchase. So again, it's another cost to them. So there are some larger farmers where they are actually starting to recycle their own waste streams because they are developing energy from them on the land, but not necessarily from the urban environment directly.
Okay, and I guess that comes down to also facilities of the farmer and the land size and things like that in terms of how much you can invest. Another one is, in your experience, what do you think drives land managers? Is sustainability actually an aspect that they take into account, or is it a fear for future lack of profit?
Gosh. It varies, everybody is different, but certainly there is now a big swell in the farming community to farm more sustainably. They know their most precious resource is the soil. Without actually using that resource sustainably, they're not going to be able to produce food for future generations and for their business to be sustainable. So that there are a lot of farmers now who are looking at different ways to manage soils, either through changing their farming practices, through changing tillage. There's a lot of people practicing no-till, and that they're interested in acquiring data and evidence from the research community as well, which is in an easily digestible form, I have to add, and also that it's practical for them to do, and it doesn't require a large expense. So I think the farming community does get quite a lot of bad press, but there is a lot of innovation that is happening in the farming community at the moment, and quite often they are innovating on the farm itself. They're not waiting for the research to come to them. They are starting to look at interventions that they can deploy themselves and find out what's going on.
So some of these technologies that you were referring to, how economically accessible are they to kind of the average farmer? Is it more targeted at large scale at the moment, or is this something that as the technology improves and becomes more widely accessible, will decrease in kind of economic expenditure?
Yeah, so certainly, so for example, the conductivity mapping, that that is a service that is available to farmers now. That there are lots of different people offering that service. The more complicated things like the reflectance spectroscopy, again, is kind of still in the research area. So that transfer to something that is affordable and reliable to be deployed in the field still needs to happen. And this is why I was picking up on the point of actually then looking across disciplines and to find sort of different technologies where we can develop sensors much cheaper than the ones that are available now, that are able then to be deployed across larger areas and to be used more systematically.
Okay, and just a final question, so I've now sent you quite a few. Maybe a little bit of an open question as well, actually, and it's a question from Richard saying, what is, or is there a current rate of degradation that is known at the moment? How much time have we got?
Gosh, you've given the hard one to ask. So there's been, I don't know where the statistic came from, but it sort of appeared in the press a few years ago about we have 60 harvests left. So this is, I think, based on an estimate of, it'd be probably some global estimate of soil erosion or something like this. If we continue with the current practices, this is probably quite a headline-grabbing thing, but it has actually made people stop and think about, well, what are we actually doing to the soil resources? We don't know some of the rates of degradation. Certainly, we know that some soils are degrading faster than others. But as I said, quite often, a lot of that degradation is masked by other things that we're doing. So we're continuing to apply fertilizers so the crop is still growing and producing a good yield. But if we have to then reduce that input, what will then happen? Well, we'll be able to actually sustain that production on that soil itself. So again, it's very difficult without widespread sort of monitoring of different aspects of soils to be able to get a handle on those, to be able to quantify what that actually is.
That's brilliant, thank you. And yeah, Richard, who asked the question, said thank you for that scary but very honest answer. I agree. There are others that have asked questions, but we're running a little short of time. So Jack's email address is on the screen, so please feel free to contact her if your question wasn't asked or if you've got any questions as a result of it. Just want to thank you, Jack, for coming. That was a really interesting webinar, and I think the quantity of questions at the end shows that it wasn't just me that thought that. For attendees, please make sure that you register your attendance on our website, CPD tool. That's easily found on the IES website. And also keep an eye out for future webinars. There's a lot more coming up every kind of month or so, so they will be advertised on our website also. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you, Jack, again for coming.